Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. In this episode, we will discuss views within the Islamic religion on Jews and on peace with Israel. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism Never Again Is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I emigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, thinedgeofthewedge.com. I grew up in the Midwest in Elgin, Illinois, a town in which there were very few Jews, and our parents and grandparents had come at the turn of the 20th century to escape the Tsar and other pogroms. Yet, in 1970, only 25 years after the end of the Holocaust, my U.S. Army officer husband and I found ourselves stationed in Munich, Germany, and this changed our lives forever.
Ofir Winter is a senior researcher at the Institute for National Securities Studies in Israel and a lecturer at the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies in Tel Aviv University. He is the author of two books, Zionism in Arab Discourses and Peace in the Name of Allah, Islamic Discourses on Treaties with Israel, that was published earlier this year. He also publishes articles on the Arab-Israeli conflict, democratization in the Middle East, and contemporary Muslim law. Ofir, we are delighted to have you as our guest today. Welcome.
I'm also happy to be with you. Thank you for this kind opportunity.
To start with, we'd like you to describe for our audience what is the subject of your book, Peace in the Name of Allah?
Yes, the title of the book is, of course, a little bit provocative. Yeah, but the book highlights maybe the happiest moments in the history of the State of Israel, at least in my opinion. The peace treaties that were signed between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors, particularly I speak in the book about Egypt, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. Of course, a lot was written about these historical moments, but I tackle in my book the story, I think, from a relatively original perspective, I hope, at least. The focus of the book is how Arab regimes try to prepare their own public opinions to the quite dramatic shift towards peace and normalization agreements with Israel following decades of conflict and war, and to legitimize what was perceived for many years in these Arab countries as an illegitimate policy or act. So, as you all know, as you all know, that these regimes face fierce domestic oppositions, especially by Islamist forces, and many of the objections for the peace were Islamic or portrayed as Islamic religious objections, and the regimes had to counter these Islamic arguments on the same religious grounds. So this is the main topic of my book, how the regimes defended or justified peace treaties with Israel, also in Islamic terms.
We have religious authorities in Arab countries. We have secular authorities in Arab countries. The seculars wanted in some Arab countries to make peace with Israel, and now the religious authorities had to deal with the religious hurdles, in the religion to make peace with Israel, right?
Yes, definitely. There are two main forces in Arab countries. One is the Islamists who stay in the opposition, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the mainstream of the Islamist movements in the Arab world. And they have, of course, the mother of the Muslim Brotherhood is Egypt. but they have also offsprings in other relevant Arab countries. And there is, from the other side, the state Islam, the religious establishment, which is financed, sponsored, supported by the regimes, and also help these regimes to defend or justify their policies on domestic issues as well as foreign affairs. Of course, my book doesn't claim that the agreements with Israel are a result of Islamic considerations, not at all. We all know that each Arab regime who made peace with Israel had his realpolitik considerations. Why to make peace with Israel? For example, to regain the Sinai Peninsula in the case of Egypt, or to gain economic benefits in the case of Jordan, or to enjoy some American weapons in the case of the United Arab Emirates. There are, or to stop an Israeli annexation, there are a lot of realpolitik considerations. But Islamic arguments were very much important to portray peace treaties with Israel, not only as kind of utilitarian or beneficial pragmatic decision, but also a religiously moral one in Islamic terms.
I find this very interesting because in the Holocaust, we know the Nazis spent incredible resources and propaganda to convince everyone, whoever they came in contact with, not just their own people, to not only hate Jews, but turn them in, et cetera, et cetera. And here we have an example of a traditional enemies of Israel using positive, I guess we could call it, propaganda to change an attitude towards Israel. I find this fascinating. And is that what encouraged you to write the book, or was there another reason that you wanted to write the book?
I will tell you the story. You know, I started to maybe think about this topic already 15 years ago. I worked in a place, it's a think tank, its name is MEMRI, Middle East Media Research Institute. And I read each and every day for more than 2 years Syrian newspapers. And when you read Syrian, of course, Syria doesn't have a peace agreement with Israel, yes?
You were reading in Arabic. I wanted to explain to our audience.
In Arabic,
you were
yes.
Getting the straight dope.
Exactly, I read it in Arabic, and I found that there is tones of hate speech in these newspapers, anti-Semitism, conspiracies against Israel and the Jews. And at the time, it was before the Arab Spring, there were still some talkings about the possibility of peace agreement between Israel and Syria, and some even peace talks or negotiations between both sides. And I asked myself, reading these newspapers, how can a regime make such a dramatic shift from such a discourse to defending peace treaties with Israel? And I tried to understand how shapers of Arab public opinions who try to support peace with Israel approach their own public opinions in order to change their traditional approaches or attitudes towards Israel. And at the beginning, I thought this is a very small scale issue, because how many Arab scholars or people support peace with Israel? It's not a very popular approach. But then I reminded that other Arab regimes already made it. I mean, of course, Egypt was the first one. It was before I was born. You were already adults at the time. You maybe remember it a little bit better than I do. But Egypt was the first one in 1977, 45 years ago, the famous visit of Sadat to Jerusalem against all the Arab world, against the Arab League, against also essential part of the Egyptian public opinion, against the heritage of Nasser, of the Egyptian regime himself. Of course, Jordan was the second one, 15 years later, in 1994. I mean, the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt was in 1979. It was signed. And there were tremendous campaigns for peace with Israel that included very interesting speeches, including, you know, what the leaders said to their own people, but also newspaper articles, propaganda booklets, songs of peace. I found dozens of songs of peace in Egypt, even postal stamps, by the way, portrayed or illustrated this transition. And also, as of course, this is maybe the main topic of my book, Islamic discourse that included fatwas, religious texts, sermons. This is the focus of my book.
So what does Islamic religion say about Jews?
Yeah, so of course the answer is that there is no one agreed upon perception, Islamic perception of Judaism or the Jewish people or even the Jewish state. There are diverse perceptions and references contemporary Muslims can choose from. What suits them best? So I'll give an example for this diversity. You know, the Muslim Brotherhood in many countries used to cite the first part of the verse 8 in Surah number 7 in the Quran, where Jews are being portrayed as the believers' greatest enemies. At the same time, or in contrast, Arab regimes, spokesmen or religious establishments used to cite the second half of the very same verse that talks about fraternity between Islam and Christians in order to legitimize peace with the people of the book, including the Jews. So it demonstrates to you that the regimes have, and also, of course, their opponents have the ability to cite the very same textual sources, but to draw different conclusions. Sometimes, of course, contradictory ones.
Yes.
Yeah. So there are positive things and tolerant things about Jews and Christians in the Quran, and you can also find hateful verses. And so,
Yes,
as a Muslim,
yes.
or as the regime, you have room to pick one or the other, is what you're saying, right?
Exactly, exactly. Generally speaking, if you go to the Quran or to the Islamic traditions, they are divided into two main periods in their treatment of Jews: an earlier, more friendly period, and a later, more hostile one. Both are genuine part of the Islamic heritage towards Jews, and both are inspiring different contemporary Muslims.
Yes. So from what my understanding is, but please correct me if I'm wrong. You're the professor of Islamic studies. I'm not. But is that the Quran was revealed over time to the Prophet, and so there are earlier verses, revelations, and later revelations, and the earlier revelations were made in Mecca, when the Prophet was in Mecca, and the later revelations were in Medina, when the Prophet was in Medina. The Mecca period of the Prophet was the period of preaching and tolerance, and the later part of his life and the revelations that came then were in a war, more in a war situation, and war directed or jihad directed, and are more aggressive and intolerant and even hateful. Is that correct?
This is very much correct. Yes.
And that the Islamists, or no, the jihadis, follow the Medina verses, the later verses, whereas moderate Muslims or reform Muslims follow more the Mecca verses, the earlier revelations. I know that Ayaan Hirsi Ali in her book Heretic, she calls it Mecca Muslims and Medina Muslims, right? And the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists are more oriented towards the end goal of the Medina revelations, for as far as I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, this is very accurate description. When we speak about Islamic, of course, there are some disagreements among Muslim interpreters about which verse is originated in which period, because it's not written in the Quran. This is a Meccan verse and this is a Medinian verse, but there are disagreements among Muslims because the Quran is not in the very exact order of chronological events. So it's not always so easy to decide and to know the exact circumstances of a specific verse. When we speak about Jews and Islam, so the friendly period in Islamic Jewish relations in the time of Prophet Muhammad, continued even during the Medinian time, after the Hijrah, when the Prophet and the people of Medina, including some of the city's Jewish tribes, signed a very famous treaty. It is known as the Constitution or the Charter of Medina. And this document set the rights and the duties of the inhabitants of Medina, including ensure their security, their freedom of worship, even mutual trade, but also their duties in order, such as, for example, recognizing Muhammad as the supreme authority of the city. The hostile period in the relations between the Prophet and the Jews began during the Medinian time. After Muhammad is realizing that the Jewish tribes, although they have these treaties with him, are unwilling to sign, are unwilling to recognize his mission and join the Islamic religion. And then the relations between both sides are starting to deteriorate, and the treaties are crumbled, and it leads to a very bloody confrontation between the Medinian tribes, Jewish tribes, and Muhammad, and a very tragic fate for some of the Jewish tribes of Medina.
Yes, I had heard that Muhammad originally had thought that the Jews would convert. I mean, it would be a conversion and join his new religion, and that when this didn't happen, that led to subsequent events. So that's the one little thing that I did know, and I think that that's something that needs to be understood in the total framework of what we talk about these topics. This is a group of people, stubborn and stiff-necked, as we call ourselves, who refused to give up Judaism. So speaking about Judaism, what is the relationship today between the Islamic religion and the high amount of anti-Semitism in Muslim populations that we see around the globe?
Yes, as I mentioned before, the problem is not in Islam generally, but specific interpretations of Islam, particularly Islamism, which is a very popular interpretation or force in contemporary Islam, but it doesn't represent all the Muslims or even most of the Muslims. Of course, I have to say that not all of the Islamists are anti-Semitic. I mean, part of them, some of the Islamist scholars, unfortunately, use in their writings anti-Semitic, bluntly anti-Semitic concepts. Some of them are relying on Quranic verses and traditions to portray the Jews as the eternal enemies of Islam since the day of Muhammad until our own days, and sometimes even as the enemies of the all humanity. There are also in many Islamist writings conspiracies that are attributed to Jews to control the world, to dominate the Islamic societies, and to corrupt them with some bad values. And this is why also when we speak about peace with Israel, that the Jews are perceived by Islamists. It's one of the reasons, not the only reason. The Jews are perceived, or the Jewish state is perceived as, let's say, unacceptable partner for peace relations with Arab Muslim countries because of the very nature, or bad nature, inherent negative nature of the Jews. Many characteristics are attributed to the Jews, like cruelty, treachery, violation of contracts. And this is one of the main arguments that are used by Islamists to oppose peace agreements with Israel.
Ofir, how has the Islamic discourse how has the Islamic discourse about Jews and Israel been changing now that some Arab countries are normalizing their relations with Israel?
Yeah, I think we see very positive trends. Some of them began before the peace treaties with Israel. For example, when we look on countries in the Gulf, like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, they started to promote, tolerate Islam, tolerate versions of Islam long before the treaties with Israel, in order to differentiate between their own Islam and the Salafi jihadi Islam of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS. So, of course, these trends are expanding following the Abraham Accords in countries like Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, even Saudi Arabia, and even Egypt. So we see some considerable positive example. We see some countries reviving Jewish heritage in the Arab societies, in the Arab countries. It is related to the normalization process with Israel, maybe also attracting Israeli tourists, and also Jewish tourists to these states to visit them. But it is also affected by the campaigns against the Islamist radicalism. And in order to cultivate a kind of religious tolerance or environment of tolerance in their own societies, and promote interfaith dialogue between Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and even some other religions. So, for example, in the UAE, we see that there is already Jewish life that is flourishing in the country, including development of educational facilities, even a Jewish school, kosher restaurants, construction of Jewish synagogues, mikvahs, even cemeteries. And some rabbis are coming from abroad and joining the United Arab Emirates in the last years.
So we see, so we see some Jewish religious life developing now in countries that are in the Abraham Accords or supporting it. And we also see a more positive tone from religious authorities about Jews in general, you're saying. And could you give some examples of that more positive tone? What is being said in these countries that are normalizing their relations with Israel? What do they say these days about Jews or Judaism?
I can give you one example. I visited a few weeks ago Morocco, Tangier. You know, Morocco has the largest Jewish community in the Arab world, approximately 3,000 people. And last August, Morocco opened a new Jewish museum in Tangier. Its name is the Beit Yehuda Museum. And it's fascinating to visit the place to see that Judaism is presented as part of the Moroccan heritage, that the king, who is also a descendant of Prophet Muhammad, presented himself as the guardian of all religions of Morocco, including Judaism. And this is only one example. You can see in the United Arab Emirates a memorial exhibition for the Holocaust in the Crossroads Civilization Museum in Dubai. Fascinating place, and the Emirati students and pupils are visiting the place and learn about the Jewish Holocaust, not from a political perspective, but from a humanitarian they learn how to identify with the Jewish tragedy from their own perspective. So these are two examples for not only a discourse, but also new institutions that promote religious tolerance between Judaism and other religions, and particularly Islam.
And recognition of the Holocaust, which was not the case for long, when the animosity was bigger between these countries and Israel, correct?
Yes, I think this is a totally new development. And even Egypt, we know about the cold peace between Israel and Egypt. So recently, in the last 2 years, we see renovation of synagogues, including the what is his name? It's Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue in Alexandria. And something even more striking, interesting, is the publication of books about the history of Egyptian Jews. Last year, not less than 12 new books were published in Egypt and were introduced during the International Book Fair of Cairo. About some of them were historical books, some of them were literature and novels about the Jews of Egypt, and they were accepted very positively by the public opinion.
That's great. But we also have the most important Sunni Islamic higher learning institute in Egypt, the Al-Azhar University. Is their tone also... There has come a lot of anti-Semitism from that institution, from religious authorities there. Is that different today?
Unfortunately not. I have to say that Al-Azhar, I looked at some of its publications. They still call Israel the Zionist entity. Every time when there is a kind of escalation between Israel and the Palestinians, they spread very anti-Semitic declarations, not only against Israel, but also against the Jews. And their discourse is very negative. There is a kind of ambivalence in Egypt in that regard, which is problematic because Egypt wants to present itself to the world as the one who carries the flag of moderate Islam, and it also asks the US to support and to give it aid for its role in fighting terrorism and radical Islam. And they do speak about religious tolerance between religions, between Islam and Christianity particularly, but when it comes to Israel and to the Jews, they still have, I think, a long way to go in order to carry this message and be and really to play a positive role in spreading more moderate Islam. Sometimes you can differentiate between their own declarations and the Islamist ones.
Is there a scenario in which the Islamic religion can further develop a positive role against anti-Semitism, or even start to develop a positive role against anti-Semitism? I don't understand yet exactly where we are in that timeline. So is there a scenario in which the Islamic religion can develop a positive role against anti-Semitism and for peace with Israel?
I think that the answer is yes. My book has shown that profound Islamic sentiments are not necessarily incompatible with position that favors compromise or peace in order to settling the conflict between Israel and the Arab countries, or even to take a position that accepts the Jewish state as a permanent reality in the Middle East. I think that if when I read Islamic sources, many of them show that there is a rich and consistent discourse across the Arab world, not in one country, in many Arab countries, led by senior clerics, according to which peace with the Jews is not only something which is permissible, but it's actually mandated by Islam. So I think that there are a lot of Islamic justifications that were used by Arab regimes that show how the Jews could be legitimate partner for peace and even want peace and normalization. Unlike the Islamist anti-Semitic discourse or approach, or even the Al-Azhar one, that treats the Jews sometimes as eternal enemies of the Muslims.
That's great news. Yeah.
So do you have suggestions for our listeners, whether Muslim or not, on how to stimulate a positive role in Islam against anti-Semitism?
Yes, I think that one example that we can speak about is the metaphor of Abraham. That we speak recently about the Abraham Accords. I think whoever invented this name was very smart in terms of marketing. Yes, a positive discourse of peace between Muslims and Jews. And this is not the first case, by the way. King Hussein of Jordan, he wanted to have warm peace with Israel with a lot of economic benefits. And he understood that he has to put the two peoples together in order to collaborate in developing this peace. And he put a lot of effort to advance the narrative that peace with the Jews is a kind of revival of the relations of the fraternity between the children of Abraham. This is how he used to call it.
Yeah.
And it was a metaphor that was very much used by him, implying that peace between Jordan and Israel, or between Muslims and Jews, is a kind of renewal of ancient blood ties between two brothers or two neighboring peoples.
Yes, very well said. And that leads us to, what are your last words? What do you want to share with our audience that we haven't yet discussed that's really important to you?
Yes, I think that I will try to end with some optimistic tone or optimistic conclusions that emerged from my study. And the conclusion is that Islam, as a system of beliefs, as traditions, as laws, is not necessarily a barrier for peace. It is Muslims, I think, that have opinions on political issues And they cite sometimes totally contrasting interpretations of Quranic verses, of prophetic texts to support their conflicting views. So I think there is a very, we should understand that there is a battle about what Islam says about peace with the Jews. There is a very important role for Arab regimes. And I think that we should, Western governments, also Israel, should think how to encourage, to promote these positive discourses, how to create climate of religious pluralism, tolerance toward Jews, toward Judaism, and also towards the Jewish state. And one last word is that, of course, we can't, I think, decide the battle about the legitimacy of peace between Muslims and Jews only on the religious field. I think it should be a peace that is beneficial for the interest of the people. And then, if it will be beneficial, it will be positive development for all sides. The justification will be found eventually in one way or another, because the flexibility of religions such as Islam.
Thank you so much for this really, really engaging and informative discussion. Ofir, we appreciate it so much. We appreciate our listeners listening to it. For those of you who have not yet watched Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, please do see this. You can see it on Amazon and YouTube. You can read more about my nonfiction Holocaust Theater project at thinedgethewedge.com. And as we end every single session, we say, please, wherever you can, without putting yourself in physical harm, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.